Good morning. Welcome to Kansas City Day / Tampa Day at Freelance Business Week. We are starting off the day with somebody whom I've been a big fan of for many, many years, 15, 20 years, who's counting? Anyway, she doesn't live in Kansas City, but she is representing because she's amazing. And I'm so excited to be bringing her in for you today. So without further ado, let me bring in Ilise Benun. Thank you so much for being here today.
Of course. I'm happy to be in Kansas City today.
Or representing anyway. Yay for virtual world.
Yes.
So Ilise is the founder of marketing-mentor.com. Go check it out. You're welcome. Don't forget the dash. The go-to online resource for creative professionals and freelancers who want better projects with bigger budgets. She's a business coach, national speaker, and author of 7 books, including The Creative Professional's Guide to Money, and 3 online courses via Creative Live. These are all tailored to the needs of creative professionals. Since 2008, Ilise has hosted the Marketing Mentor podcast, and I'm so excited to bring her here today to talk about, well, the title presentation is Show Me the Money. So we're going to be talking about money, having those difficult conversations. Just a heads up for you viewers, she will be taking questions at the end. So you can go ahead and submit them, but just know, stay tuned after she's done so she can answer those questions for you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ilise. Yay! Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Julie, for the invitation. And I am thrilled to be here. And we're going to talk about money. But let me just first say, actually, I was thinking about this on my walk this morning, that the reason I talk a lot about money and marketing is because those two things are integrally connected. In other words, if you have money problems, the solution is usually a marketing solution. So I'm not going to talk about marketing today. I'm going to focus on the money, but just know that these two things are connected. So let me enlarge that a little bit. Okay, so show me the money. I like to also call this presentation Learning to Love the Money Conversation, because I really do believe it's important to learn to love the money conversation. And I don't need to give you any details except to show you the cover of my book, The Creative Professional's Guide to Money. Julie did a good job of introducing me, so thank you for that. I'll start with some statistics. Did you know that 43% of Americans don't know how much money their spouse makes? That is a little alarming. And money isn't just, it's an issue for everyone, but 53% of men are more comfortable asking about salaries than women. We're not talking about salaries here. We're not talking about JOBs. But still, I think that this statistic is relevant, especially for women. And I think what we can learn about money applies to everyone, but especially women. So just to say that if you don't love the money conversation, you're really not alone. For some reason in our culture, especially, people just avoid the money conversation. And then another problem with it is that when your work is personal, and as a freelancer, and especially as a creative freelancer, your work is often very personal. It's just hard to separate the work from the business, the personal from the business. And so our feelings about money and what we're quote unquote worth get all caught up in the money conversation. And so I'm going to try to dispel some of those things. And I'll start by telling you why I love the money conversation. It puts me in a position of strength because your clients actually often also don't love the money conversation. So if you approach it and address it and take the initiative with the money conversation, it does put you in a position of strength. And when I do that, I come across as confident, even when I don't feel confident. So that will help you build confidence. It shows my professionalism. There are definitely people out there who, based on experience, believe that freelancers are flaky and that you can't depend on them. And when you love the money conversation and when you initiate the money conversation, right off the bat, that separates you from all those flaky freelancers. I know none of you are those flaky freelancers, but that precedes you. That reputation precedes you. So you really must come across as professional in everything that you do. And you'd be surprised, it's often the little things, including talking about money. I also think that when I love the money conversation, it makes it easier. It smooths the way for my collaborators and for my clients. And that will make them feel taken care of. And that will make them trust you. And needless to say, but I'll say it anyway, when I love the money conversation and when I initiate the money conversation, I am so much more likely to get what I need in terms of money, but also everything else. So I highly recommend that you learn to love the money conversation. So the big idea here is that the money conversation actually starts with what you say to yourself. You might think, oh, that's what I say to my clients, but it starts a lot earlier inside your own head, by the way. And some of the things I hear people say inside their head are, I'm not a business person. So I believe that there is no such thing actually as a business person. There are business things you do, and there are creative things that you do, and all sorts of other things that you do. But if you start to label yourself as something and not another thing, that is automatically going to limit you. So please stop saying this, especially to yourself. Also, I hear people saying constantly, I don't like talking about money. Well, that just reinforces the problem. If you don't like it, you're not going to practice it and you're not going to get very good at it. And therefore, you're not going to make very much money. So let's stop saying, I don't like talking about money. And this relates to the issue I mentioned already about the connection between the personal and the professional. Because if you believe that, then you probably are saying to yourself, I don't like putting a price on my work, because that automatically puts a price on yourself. And so this will get in your way. Also, a lot of people believe that you have to give them, quote unquote, them, the client, what they're asking for. Sometimes you do, but not always, especially when it's at your own expense. So I really believe you have to first give yourself what you need, money-wise, time-wise, scope-wise, everything-wise, right? You have to give yourself what you need. And so I'm thinking of starting the hashtag me first. You're welcome to use it. Because the bottom line is that if you don't value your services, who will? They certainly won't, especially if you don't. So I want to start with, now that we know what not to say to ourselves, now we're going to talk to the clients. And often the clients will ask us questions sooner, sometimes rather than later, that we're not ready to answer. And so this, again, is what I mean when I say you don't necessarily have to give them what they're asking for. So if they say, what's your hourly rate? I am not a proponent of quoting hourly rates. I'm not a proponent of working on an hourly basis. There are certain situations where there's an exception that can be made, but in general, it's not good for you and it's not good for them. The main reason is because the better you get, the faster you get, the less you will make. That is definitely not right. So my recommendation in general is to price other ways, especially with a fixed rate or a flat fee, so that when someone says, what's your hourly rate? Because that's often the only question they know to ask. It's not their fault, right? But you have to disabuse them of the idea that you actually work that way. And the thing to say, this is actual language you can use, is, I'm sorry, that's not how I work. It's better for both of us if I give you a fixed price, and here's why. That way you will know how much it will cost, and you will know, as the freelancer, what you're going to earn. And you don't need to say this, but what you should also know is that they won't be trying to estimate how long things are going to take you, or counting the hours, or worried about whether they ask you to do something else, because then it might cost them more. You want to take all of that stress out of the conversation. So what's your hourly rate? That's not how I work. Here's how I work, which is another way to come across with your professionalism. You've done this before. You've been down this road before. This is how it goes. Another question that a client will ask, and you can kind of fill in the blank with whatever the noun is here, but how much is a blank? How much is a website? And of course, at the beginning of a project, you can't usually answer that question. And sometimes even a little later on, you can't answer that question. So the way to answer it by not answering it is saying something like, well, that's like asking how much is a car, right? It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So tell me more, and then I will give you some pricing. And what you're really trying to do here is slow the conversation down, which may go against what you feel you want to do, because most people just want to get this conversation over with or not be in it in the first place. But I'm suggesting that you slow the conversation down so that you can, number one, learn as much as you can about the project, learn as much as you can about the client or the prospect and how they work and how responsive they are and how much they know about what they actually need, because sometimes the client has really very little idea about what they need. You are the expert. You know more than they do. But unless you take the time to explain that to them and ask the questions, the really good questions that show what you know, then they're not going to get that information and you're not going to get the information you need. So really slow it down, especially when they start out with these questions. Another way to answer this one, how much is a fill in the blank, is, well, it can range from 4X's to 5X's. And actually, you can use X's or you can use actual numbers. It's up to you. I would try it both ways. But the point here is, let's figure out what's important to you. And then when I'm ready, I will quote you a price. So again, you're taking control. You're taking the lead in the conversation. They are not the boss of you, as I like to say. And this is one way to just lay the groundwork from the very beginning. Because the thing about numbers is that they're kind of magical. As soon as you start putting numbers in front of them on the table, they suddenly seem to know things they didn't even know they knew. So when you are starting to talk about numbers, but not ready to give your price, here are a few different approaches so that you can do that properly and get the information, again, that you need from them. So you can give them a spectrum. You can say, are you thinking 500, 5,000, or 50,000? And this actually is a magical question, because you may notice I'm not recommending that you say, what's your budget? I used to advise people to ask for the budget, but I stopped doing that because the clients usually don't know, or even if they do know, they don't want to tell you. However, you desperately need that information to know whether or not it's a good fit for you. So you want to talk about money in the very first conversation, not necessarily at the beginning. As I'm saying, you need to ask your questions first. And then at the end of that conversation, you're going to start putting numbers on the table, but these numbers are not your prices. So when you give them a spectrum, you're not saying, well, for that website, I could charge you 500, 5,000, or 50,000. You're not saying that. You're saying, here's a spectrum, a very wide spectrum, almost an absurd spectrum. Please put yourself on that spectrum. And they generally will, and they generally know where they are on that spectrum. They'll say something like, well, we're not talking about $50,000. We're definitely not talking about 500. We were thinking more along the lines of 5 to 10 or 2 to 3. But that way, you're really getting a gauge for what they're thinking about. And that is really important. However, sometimes this doesn't work. And then my advice is push a little. Don't just pull back and say, oh, I guess they're not going to tell me, right? You need to push a little. That is another way to lead the conversation and make sure you get what you need. Because what you don't want is for someone to say, oh, just send me a proposal. Because if you do that, you don't know if the number you come up with is going to be too high or even too low. And if it is one or the other, it's going to be a waste of your time. And so I'm trying to help you not waste your time by learning to love the money conversation, essentially. Here's another approach to that. You can give them a choice. So you give them a spectrum, which is 3 numbers, very wide-ranging numbers, or you can give them 2 options. And the choice is, are you thinking in the hundreds or the thousands? And sometimes that will prompt them to have an idea or give you an idea of what they are actually thinking. Because the thing is that the good ones do want to pay a fair price, and they expect to negotiate with you. And again, that is where you are slowing down the conversation. You are asking the questions. You are not presuming that the first numbers that you talk about are going to be the only numbers. In fact, I was listening to a podcast last night where someone who has become an expert on money was talking about a mistake that she made in her past when she was negotiating a salary, and they offered something like $32,000. And it didn't even occur to her that she could negotiate, that she could ask for more. And the thing about the good clients, I call them good because they may not know what this project should cost or even what they have to spend yet, but they do expect to negotiate. And so you want to go into it that way. So I'm going to go over 7 of the worst negotiating mistakes. And I say the worst because these are actually the smallest, the most imperceptible, and therefore the easiest to ignore, and therefore the most lethal mistakes. And most people have made all of them at one point in their career. And the whole point actually is to be making your mistakes and learning from them so you never make them again. So maybe when we get to the Q&A section, you can talk a little bit and share your own experience about what mistakes you've made and what you've learned from them. So the first point I want to make about negotiation is that it is a conversation, not a confrontation. I do think that one of the reasons people avoid the money conversation and avoid negotiating is because they somehow imagine that they have to go defended, that they have to defend against something, against their value, against their worth, against their numbers. But it really doesn't have to be a confrontation. And in fact, I think if you approach it as a conversation between two people, two real people, no matter what the project is or even what the job is, then you will approach it in a much warmer way, in a more trusting way, and in a more relaxed way. And that relaxes everyone. Because when you go in defended and imagining it's going to be a confrontation, then people sense that even if you don't say anything about it. So we really want to take the temperature down on all of these conversations. And that's why I say when you love the money conversation, you will see it as a fun kind of conversation that you love to have. I'm telling you the truth when I say that is my perception of it at this point, 33 years into my career. So mistake number 1 is when they put a number on the table, you just take it. You take whatever's offered. So they, being the client or the prospect, say, I've got $1,000. And you just say, okay, I'll take it. That is their floor. That is the lowest number they have. That means they have higher numbers. And if you just take it, you're doing what they call leaving money on the table. And the other thing I think you're doing in that type of situation is you are basically saying, I'm not a professional, I'm an amateur, because you're just taking it and you don't want to be in the conversation. Again, I want to encourage you to put yourself, go beyond your comfort zone and get into this conversation until it becomes your comfort zone. So when they put the first number on the table, what you do is you ask for more. And I know this is really scary. That's why I call it mistake number 1. This is one of the scariest things for people. And I think in the example that I was sharing earlier about this woman who it didn't occur to her to negotiate, it's because she didn't think she could ask for more. And she was saying actually that often people imagine asking for more is going to remove the offer from the table in the first place or make them suddenly vanish into thin air. Because I do think there's some magical thinking that goes along with this. And that's what we're trying to eliminate as well. So when they put the first number on the table, you simply ask for more. I personally, at this point in my career, like to double it. I'm not suggesting that you should double it necessarily, but when you ask for more, that basically creates the parameters of the negotiation. So if someone said, I've got $1,000, you might say, well, generally, I will do this for $2,000. And that implies, without you even saying it, that the compromise, the fee, if you come to terms, is going to be somewhere between 1 and 2. So when you ask for more, you could either double it or you could just add a little bit. And that's the thing to do if you're not comfortable with this yet. Just little by little, baby steps are really the key to success. Baby steps. Just add 10%, add 20%, add 25%, and see what happens. And this is all about testing the waters with each situation that comes up. And this is the way you learn. So, mistake number 1, the solution is ask for more. Mistake number 2 is when you make the first offer, you don't start high enough. So first, let me say, sometimes people have a rule of you shouldn't be the one who puts the first number on the table. I actually don't believe that. I think it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on a lot of different factors. So we need to have a strategy for both situations, not a rule that says, I don't want to ever be the one to put the first number on the table. Sometimes you will be, and sometimes you won't be. When they put the number on the table, when they make the first offer, when you make the first offer, the mistake I see people making is not starting high enough. You have to start high, which is your ceiling, which is as high as you think you want to go or they may be willing to pay, because you need to give yourself room to negotiate. Remember, these are the parameters of the conversation. So you start here and they're going to give you something lower, and then you're going to find something and hopefully come to terms in the middle. So you want to give yourself room to negotiate. Sometimes people don't do this because they imagine that once you give a number, you have to stick to it, as if it were something rigid, something final, as if coming down on your fee is a sign of weakness. I don't believe that. If you approach this conversation with confidence, then whether you go up or down, it doesn't matter. It's part of the negotiation. So don't believe that you have to come up with the perfect number. There is no perfect number. And never budge from that number. That's not the way it works. Okay, mistake number 3 is when you make assumptions about what they can and cannot pay. And often these assumptions seem to be based on what you can and cannot pay, because often we are very self-centered and we can't see how someone is going to be able to pay more than we can pay or more than we imagine it's worth. So the solution to this problem is to, number 1, don't make assumptions. And number 2, to ask your questions. And so this again requires that you slow the conversation down. You might have to say, you know what? I have a few questions I need to ask you before we even begin to talk about money. And actually, that is a nice way to plant a seed that a little later on, you're going to be talking about money. So get ready. You can do that at the beginning of your conversation. But don't make assumptions about what they can and cannot pay. Instead, have your questions ready, or just respond naturally with the questions that come to your mind so you can figure out what they actually can pay. I have one client who tells a story about almost making this mistake, actually, when she was in a conversation, not a confrontation, a negotiation with a prospect, and he was wanting, I think it was a brand identity. And she was getting ready to say, well, it's about $10,000. And then she stopped herself and she asked for his budget. And he actually knew what his budget was and had one and was willing to tell her. And he said, oh, we probably couldn't spend more than $100,000. And she was like trying to keep a straight face, and then said, all right, I think we can work with that. Right? And then came up with a budget that was more in line with what he had in mind. So if she had gone with her assumption about what she thought he might be able to pay, who knows what that's based on, then she would have left a lot of money on the table. So let that story and that almost mistake be your lesson. Mistake number 4 is being impulsive and blurting out numbers. I have one client who says, I either freeze or I blurt. And I think that happens to a lot of people. But we don't want to do either. And we especially don't want to blurt numbers out because they're either too high or too low. And I actually have a story about having blurted out some numbers and they were way too low. And it's not impossible to recover from that kind of situation. You can, and I did actually go back after the fact, after a day or two, and say, you know what? I gave you a number that was just way too low after I slept on it and thought about it. And I'd like to try again, if you don't mind. And they were like, sure, why not? Right? They weren't married to that number. And I think it was important because I did not want to absorb the cost and keep it at that number. So the solution here is to take time to think. Don't be impulsive. Don't blurt out numbers. They may be pushing you. They may be a little in a hurry. They may even be a little bullying you, but you don't have to take that. And you can say, you know what? I always sleep on it. I never give numbers in the first conversation. So I've got some good information. I have a sense of what you have to spend, and I'm going to come back to you with some numbers. Don't give in to that impulsivity. Mistake number 5 is being desperate and not having a backup plan. This is not about coming across as desperate. This is actually solving the root problem, which is being desperate. Because when you're desperate, no matter what you try to hide or show, people feel it. And the way to approach a negotiation as a conversation, it really helps if you are not in a desperate situation, meaning, I really need this project. I really need this money. And that's an easy thing to say. Don't be desperate. And this is where the money connects to the marketing. Because if you have a full pipeline of really good projects, which is the effect of ongoing marketing. It's not something, oh, you put your marketing in place overnight and then you're not desperate. It doesn't work that way. But once you have put your marketing foundation in place, then you will not feel desperate and you will feel like, all right, I could take this or leave it. I hope I get it. But if I don't get it, I have a backup plan. I have other options. You know what you're going to do. You know what you're going to replace it with if you don't get it. So that easier said than done, but don't be desperate and do everything you can to give yourself options. All right, mistake number 6 is betraying your nervousness by talking too much. So I want to just acknowledge that until you learn to love the money conversation, and maybe even when you do love the money conversation, you're going to be nervous. There's nothing wrong with being nervous. But you also need to know all the different ways that you react and behave when you're nervous. And sometimes people talk too much when they're nervous. So that is definitely something you can work on. You don't want to betray your nervousness with that because talking too much actually creates a lot of other problems. So the solution, again, easier said than done, is let there be silence. In other words, put your numbers on the table, ask your questions, and then shut up and let them talk. And if you're on the phone or on a Zoom call, you should be able to hear, are they falling off their chair? Are they gasping? What is happening, right? And when you let there be silence, and I mean silence verbally, but also in your head, because that's the way you will be able to see clearly what is happening on the other side. Again, so many people are unfortunately way too self-centered and thinking about, oh my God, what are they thinking about me? What are they going to say about me? And then you miss the information, verbal and otherwise, that is right in front of you. So let there be silence inside and out. And don't betray your nervousness by talking too much. And finally, mistake number 7 is devaluing your services by cutting your prices. So what I don't mean here is that what I said before, you start high and then come down in your negotiation. That is not cutting your prices unless you don't adjust the scope as well, right? If you are adjusting the scope, then you are not devaluing your services. So the example is a student that I was coaching recently. So a young guy who doesn't have a lot of experience, but has a lot of enthusiasm and is kind of fearless. And someone came to him and wanted him to create a mural, or I think it was 7 murals actually. And they said, how much would it cost? And he had not heard my presentation yet, so he didn't know how to slow the conversation down. So he blurted out a number, and I think he said something like $20,000. And they said, oh, that's a little high. And he said, all right, 10. So that is devaluing your services by cutting your prices. Instead, he could have said, all right, let me think about it. Now I know what you want to spend. I will come back to you with what I can do for that number, right? That is the way to approach it. Let me figure out what I can do for that number. And then you're going to give them options, actually, one at the high side, one at the low side, maybe even one in the middle. And that is not devaluing your services because you are adjusting the scope, you are adding services, options, revisions, etc. So always be sure to adjust the scope. All right. I have a couple more thoughts, and then I will be ready to open it up to questions. So often I get the question, should you work for friends and family? And that is a similar question in my mind to, does it make sense to work for free? And I put them together and say, should you work for free for friends and family? Now, there are lots of different answers to this question, but mine is on the unconventional side because I don't really understand why friends and family get a discount. In fact, I kind of think they should pay more because they know what you're worth. They know how hard you've worked. They know how hard you work. They know how good you are, and they want to support you. So I would push back in most situations when someone says, can I get your friends and family discount? And maybe even say, what friends and family discount? Now, the other point I want to make about this is that you may want to give a discount to friends and family, which is fine. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about freelancing and being self-employed is the autonomy and the flexibility and how you basically get to do what you want when you want. And that means you can work for free for friends and family if you want to. But the thing that bothers me is when it is the expectation or even the obligation. Like I had a situation recently where someone said, well, my mother needs a logo and she expects me to give her the friends and family discount or to do it for free. And that isn't right, in my opinion. Again, you get to decide what to give or not to give your mother, but just think about whether or not it is something you want to offer, in which case it is your prerogative, or something that is expected of you, in which case you may not have that as your policy. Totally up to you. And then what about scope creep? So scope creep is when the scope of the project, as it has been laid out and as it has been agreed to, and you've already gotten a 50% or 33% deposit on the project according to what you thought it was going to be when you first had your conversation. And then what often happens, especially with digital and interactive and web projects, is the scope begins to creep. And the client will say, oh, well, can't you just do this extra page? Oh, we forgot we needed a whole other section on the website about this. Or, oh, the president of the company just decided that we were going to go in a different direction. So let's do it this way, right? Those are all examples of actual scope creep that happens. And this is a very tricky situation for many freelancers because, again, you have to learn to love the money conversation in order to speak up. That is the most important element here, is that you have to speak up and let the client know that this is not what you agreed to. Because that's the thing, as I said before, the clients are not the experts in the kind of work that you do, and they know very little about it, much less than you do. So they may not even, you may not believe this, but they may not even realize that when they're asking you for one more page, they're diminishing it in their own mind because maybe they think it's going to cost something more, but they don't realize that that is actually not what you agreed to, right? So especially when there's a change in direction and they just assume, oh, well, we're just going to do it differently. It's not a big deal. It's not all that different, right? So it's your responsibility to say, you know what? Hold on. We need to have a conversation about this. This is not what we agreed to. And then you offer to renegotiate or come up with an estimate for what the additional scope would be. And that's the way you use actually generosity as a marketing tool, and you offer to come up with a new estimate. And that is your way of saying it's going to cost more, right? You don't have to come right out and say, I'm sorry, but that's going to cost more. You say, I'm happy to come up with an estimate for you if you want to do this, this, and this in addition, because that is not part of what we agreed to. But the point to remember here is that they don't know, and is your responsibility to let them know and to stop things. And there's really a very short window of time between when they say something like, oh, let's throw this in also, and it needs to be done. Often there's a rush. Oh my God, it's got to be done right away. And so the time frame is very short, and you really can't miss it, because then it'll be too late and it looks really unprofessional to go back and say, well, you know, that thing you asked me to do and I did, and I haven't charged you for it. I'm going to need to charge you more for it. That is a surprise that clients don't like. So we don't want to have any surprises when it comes to marketing and when it comes to money. So here's my final thought for you before I wrap up, and then we do questions. You will always be too expensive for some and too cheap for others. Always. There's never going to be perfection. But as long as you feel good about your value, then your pricing will be right for those who are right for you. That is the way it works. Because as creative professionals, I do think that we tend to discount and dismiss our own accomplishments and capabilities before we even get to the negotiating table. I do think we can change that. I do think you can change that. That's why I'm here. And so that means going from I'm not a business person to unlearn and evolve into a savvy business person. It means going from I don't like talking about money to I can ask for and get paid what I need, or I'm walking away because I have all these other options. Because if you don't value your services, I ask you, who will? So I do have a freebie, which I think is on the website somewhere. It's called the Money Talk Cheat Sheet, and it has some of the things I've shared, and you can get it at gettalk.at/money. And we can share that somewhere else also, but gettalk.at/money. And now I am happy to take questions, or even if you don't have a question, I always love to hear what people learned. So tell me what you learned today. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to come back. Whenever you are ready, Julie.
Thank you so much, Ilise. That was amazing. So we've got some questions popping up in the chat here. The first one here, I don't know if you can see it, but it says, what are your thoughts on charging a discounted rate, whether retainer or hourly rate, for nonprofit, true 501c3 public charities? And then they also added a note, nonprofits often have dedicated money from donors that the donors want to be spent on what you're doing. They're not worried about profit, so often will spend more. I'm not sure if that note came from the same person or not, but let's get your opinion on that, Ilise.
All right, and I can't see it, so I'm just going to remember what you said. First of all, this goes back to the mistake Oh, I see it there. Okay. To the mistake I'm about making assumptions, right? This is the assumption that a nonprofit has no money. That is not always the case. It is sometimes the case. And as was stated, sometimes there is money earmarked for certain types of situations, certain types of projects. So, yes, totally your prerogative if you want to offer a discount to a nonprofit. If you can afford to do that, you might, say that your rate is 5,000, but my discounted rate for you is 4,000, right? I mean, you need to frame it and they need to understand that they're getting a discount, because if you don't tell them you're giving them a discount, then they're going to think that's your rate.
Very good. Okay, next one coming up for you here is, what about having a clause in your retainer contract, reserving the right to increase your fee if work effort exceeds mutual expectations?
Yes. I think, okay, we haven't talked about retainers, so maybe we should talk about retainers first before we talk about clauses in retainer contracts. So a retainer, I'll just define for you so that you know how I think about it. A retainer is an agreement between you and a client for work on an ongoing basis over time. And there are many different types of retainers. The most common are based on hourly rates. So, I'll give you 20 hours a week at this hourly rate. Now, the problem with that is that, I'll just say the benefit first is that they do expect, if they're going to commit to you to work on an ongoing basis, they expect a discount. That is often the way it is. And you can offer a discount, and you can even justify a discount because you don't have to do the marketing. That amount of time is covered and you can rely on it until you can't, right? And none of this is set in stone. And during the pandemic, there were lots of people whose retainers were just totally disappeared. So it's only as reliable as it can be until it's not anymore. So it does make sense to be offering a discount. But the problem with the hourly rate type of contract is that, again, they have no idea how long things take you. So it means you have to be really clear and communicate really clearly about what they're actually getting for that time, because otherwise people start imagining things. So I'll suggest one other way to do retainers as an alternative, and then I'll address the question, which is I like retainers that are based on scope. So, and I'll say first that you only want to get into a retainer arrangement and relationship with someone you trust, a company you trust, and that they already trust you. So I wouldn't right off the bat jump into a retainer. You need to get to know them a little bit, because that way you'll know how long things actually take with them and how responsive they are and all of those things. So a retainer based on a project scope is essentially, we're going to do these projects, right? This, and this every month or over the course of 6 months. And you're going to pay us this month this much on a monthly basis, and here's what you're going to get. Here are the deliverables you're going to get. And the reason I say there has to be trust there is because those things will change and you may not know always at the beginning. So it requires, again, a lot of communication. But if they trust you and they know you're not going to try to cheat them, then this is a better approach. So based on scope. So now, what about having a clause in your retainer contract reserving the right to increase your fee if work effort exceeds mutual expectations? Yes, I think it makes sense, but it also plants the seed of the I don't know, right? The unknowns. And it means you're going to have a conversation. And I think what I would add to that clause is we will come to you and tell you how much we think it's going to cost or what is excessive, and come up with something that makes sense for you, because otherwise that plants the seed of you may have surprises along the way. I hope that answers the question.
Very good. So the next one that's coming in says, fantastic advice. I only wonder if my thoughts on pricing have become outdated. I've been working in my field since the 1990s, and I wonder how to gauge how much to increase my rates over time to keep in step with the market. Any advice?
So, I mean, the whole issue of raising your rates is a tricky one and definitely needs to be done over time, especially if you've been in the industry for many, many years, as it seems you have. And so, I mean, even just with inflation and the increase of the cost of everything, hopefully you will have raised your prices. And I guess one thing that I didn't have a chance to say during the presentation, which I will say now, is that I really don't think there is a standard going rate for almost anything. Because even if there are, rate books, and even the Graphic Artists Guild puts out the pricing handbook, which is wonderful. It's just that your clients are not reading the pricing handbook. So they don't know what the going rate is. And you can tell them, but they may not be able to afford it. So really the thing about pricing is this is why it's a conversation between you and your prospect or client, so that you can figure out what can they afford, and then what do I need to make, and where do we find something in the middle? So with that said, I will say that the best way to increase your rates is with every new client, you just charge more. Little by little, you inch it up so that you're gauging what the market will bear. And the difficult part is going back to a client that you've been working with for 30 years and saying, okay, it's time to raise your rates now. And you're not adjusting the scope also. And so it's hard for them to mentally grasp why they should pay more for this thing that they've been paying this much for. So again, that is a trust issue. That's a relationship issue. And one of the ways I've counseled people to do this is basically to say, and this happens often with the first few clients that you get as a freelancer, because you didn't feel very confident, so you didn't really want to charge them that much. And now you're still working with them years later and you haven't raised the rate, and it just feels horrible. And you're maybe even resenting them for it, but it's your responsibility and it's your fault. So the thing to say is, all right, we've been working together for this many years now, and I've never raised my rates to you. And the new people that I'm working with are actually paying this. So I'm not going to say, here's what you have to pay now, but let's see if we can get you closer to that. What is affordable to you? And again, that's a conversation, not a confrontation, not an ultimatum. And you work together if you want to keep the client. If you don't want to keep the client, then you just raise your rate. But and sometimes that backfires, by the way. But you work together with them to little by little inch their rate up.
Very good. I love that. I've been giving myself a raise every single year, just a little bit every time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I have that conversation regularly, like, hey, it's time to give me a raise. If you're not going to do it, who else will?
Exactly.
So, next up, we have a comment, and I think this comes from the nonprofit question person,
all right.
Who says, thank you. Definitely agree about the need to be clear that any lower rate offered for nonprofits is indeed a discount from your normal rates.
Yes.
Very good. Well, that's all I have on my end. Are there any other comments or questions you all have for Ilise? Speak now or forever hold or reach out to her later. She's amazing.
Yes.
Ilise, your website again for the masses, marketing.
Yes, and I think I even have a slide here. So marketing-mentor-tips.com is where you can sign up for my quick tips, and marketing-mentor.com is where you can find my podcast and my simplest marketing plan and all sorts of other free resources.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Ilise, for coming on and representing Kansas City today. Really appreciate. You've always got such insightful information. And I know I picked up a bunch of tips myself, and you just kind of reiterated things that I teach and speak and preach about myself. So Thank you so much. It's always a joy to hear from you, and so blessed to have you with us today. Stay tuned, everybody else. Freelance Business Week continues. Tampa is up next, and then I will be presenting at 12:15 myself with how to rock your freelance business.
Excellent.
We will see you later. Thank you, Ilise.
Thank you, Julie.
Bye-bye.